Greetings all. Thank you so much for the invitation for me to speak and moderate the session with my friend Michelle Nunn, who is the President and CEO of CARE USA. Today, we'll be talking about CARE's work around the world. As many of you might know, CARE works around issues of poverty, saving lives, social justice, and they've been doing this for many years. CARE has worked in over 100 countries around the world and has reached about 70 million people in the work that they do. Today, Michelle and I are going to talk about building resilience through women's leadership, a topic, of course, that is extremely relevant during these times of multiple crises. So I'm really excited, Michelle, to have this conversation with you. Let us dive right in, and please tell us a little bit more about CARE.
Thank you, Tasneem. And it's such an honor to be with you today and the extraordinary work that you do through Climate Action Network. So yes, let me tell you a little bit about CARE's history. It was 75 years ago, actually this year, that a small group of Americans came together and they invented the CARE package, the idea that is now a part of our lexicon in so many ways. But back then meant actually sending surplus US Army rations and then later food packages to European refugees. And over time, we sent over 100 million CARE packages, but we've evolved into much more than that over time. We now work in 100 countries. And as you said, our mission is to save lives and to defeat poverty. And we do this by centering our work around women and girls, which is why I'm so glad to be talking to you today about this. We put women and girls in the center because we know that there's no way of overcoming poverty until all people have equal rights and equal opportunities. And we really feel like we are tackling the biggest challenges of our time. And we know that the very most central challenge of our time and the biggest threat to progress in defeating poverty is climate change. And it's why CARE is prioritizing combating climate change in our vision that we've set for ourselves for 2030. It's why we're releasing reports such as Evicted by Climate Change on the gendered impact of climate-induced displacement, which we know is disproportionately affecting and impacting women and girls. And we know that climate change is threatening our progress on poverty and means enormous setbacks. You know, many of us, I think, read the Goalkeepers report, and we saw that we've in 25 weeks lost up to 25 years of progress. Climate change will dwarf that and is already showing us that this regression is something we have to fight against. It's also showing us that we are creating and compounding humanitarian disasters all over the world. And again, the majority of climate change evacuees are women and girls. So that's in sum why we are so much putting climate at the center of our work, and especially recognizing its impact on women and girls.
Thanks for that, Michelle. So to help frame up the conversation a bit more, can you talk a little bit about gender justice and why women and girls? Why women and girls, especially when we're thinking about climate change?
Yeah, and people, I think, don't always make that connection, as you know, Tasneem. So I think it is really important to think about, why do we talk about women and girls and the gendered implications of the climate crisis? So maybe just to give you a couple of examples. One is that we know that climate and climate disasters and climate challenges around the world have a disproportionate impact on those who are already already inequitable in terms of their standing in societies. So if you think about women and girls, again, the burdens of care as an example, women and girls are taking on the primary responsibility for children, for the elderly. We know that women carry out 76% of the total amount of work, which is over 3 times that of men. And we also know that, for instance, when women are displaced in disasters and face the kinds of crisis that climate brings on, that they faced additional risks like gender-based violence, domestic violence, maternal mortality, forced marriage, sexual trafficking. So that's one reason. Second reason is that the social and cultural norms and barriers that already exist for women are less likely to be involved in decisions about how to prevent, mitigate, cope with climate change, including, for instance, when to leave their homes. And so, again, those norms make already difficult choices even more difficult. And finally, if you think about it, women and girls do most of the subsistence farming in poor countries, and they're the primary providers of food, of water, of fuel. And we know that when climate change has its impact, those are some of the primary the sort of changes that families have to face. These are so important when we think about family nutrition, putting meals on the table, breastfeeding. Women are often the ones that are eating last. And so we know that these are disproportionate impacts, but we also know that women and girls, when they are equipped with the tools of adapted and diversified crops, of new forms of livelihood, that they can overcome and lead the way in adapting and overcoming some of the challenges of climate.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. So CARE International and Climate Action Network International, the network that I head, has a long history of collaboration. I mean, we promoting climate justice and stood together shoulder to shoulder in our fight and in solidarity with especially vulnerable countries in pushing for the 1.5 degree target, especially to be part of the Paris Agreement. And we're very proud of that collaboration and our partnership in that, and especially for adaptation and action on adaptation and loss and damage and support for that. So one of the reasons that I'm particularly proud that we have CARE as a member of CAN is because CARE is one of those organizations that have consistently and pointedly recognized the intersection between gender justice and climate justice. And so you mentioned that you've just adopted or endorsed the new Vision 2030. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. It's really inspiring. And so please tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, we have been so proud to stand in solidarity with CAN and with the extraordinary network that you are orchestrating and leading. And I think it's one of many reasons why we have seen the need to, again, lift up climate change in our own goals as we think about what we need to achieve and contribute over the next 10 years. So we know that with the current trajectory of climate change, we will not meet our sustainable development goals without both mitigation and adaptation. And so if you recognize that, and if you also look at, for instance, the enormity of the humanitarian crises and natural disasters that are before us, and you think about, for instance, women and girls and the disproportionate impact that they have. I don't think people realize, for instance, we've done some studies that show in the event of a disaster, the risk of death for women and girls is 10 times higher than men. In just one study, in 1991 cyclone disaster in Bangladesh, 90% of the people who lost their lives were women and girls. And so we know, though, also, again, that women and girls are on the front lines of combating climate change. I know that Mary Robinson spoke eloquently to this. We know that when we invest in women and girls, that we can actually affect both mitigation and adaptation around climate change. Many of y'all will have read Project Drawdown. You know that it was noted that if we invest in girls' education and family planning and combine those two, it becomes the second most powerful solution solution for mitigating climate change. And then if you think about adaptation, we have to be able to invest in women as frontline farmers, providers of food, and frontline community organizers of change. And so it's why CARE has chosen our 2030 goal, which is 25 million poor and marginalized people, particularly women and girls, have strengthened their resilience and their adaptive capacities to the effects of climate change, and that they're also contributing to the energy transition. So that's one of the very big mega goals that we're embracing as part of our vision for the next 10 years.
25 million people within this decade is a huge goal to set. And I'm sure with all of your work and of course support from others, I'm certain you're going to achieve that. But it's still very hard to imagine. So it would be really good to hear some of your thinking in terms of how you see that materializing.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard, when we talk about climate change, it can be so large and feel so difficult to tackle. And when you talk about millions of people, I maybe we'll just bring it down. And I want to share with you all a video of Maria Raquel Vasquez, who is a leader with Madre Tierra, a Guatemalan civil society organization. We're CARE partners. And I think she, through her story, will tell you a bit about both the impacts of climate on women, but also their power as change agents to do something powerful about it.
Si yo fuera un color, sería verde, como mi entorno, tranquilo y fuerte. La tierra está cambiando porque ha habido una mala administración de ella. Si la naturaleza no está protegida, ¿qué nos queda? Esta tierra corre profundo por nuestras venas. Hay una relación de la tierra con las mujeres porque las dos alimentan al mundo, al ser humano. Las dos dan vida. Cuando me convertí en líder, tuve que perder la vergüenza y el miedo a hablar. La violencia, la discriminación y los problemas que enfrentan las mujeres, tenemos que tener claridad y comprender que no es algo con lo que hayamos nacido, sino es un problema que la misma sociedad se ha encargado de imponer y de decirnos que las mujeres no tenemos derecho, cuando en la realidad nosotras también tenemos capacidad de pensar, analizar y de proponer. El impacto más fuerte que estamos teniendo del cambio climático en la vida de las familias, las comunidades y las mujeres es la escasez del agua. Bueno, nosotras venimos desarrollando a nivel de las comunidades, de los grupos, especialmente con autoridades comunitarias, un proceso de capacitación y análisis para identificar las capacidades y las vulnerabilidades de una comunidad. Hemos también pedido el acompañamiento de Conred a nivel nacional. Ellos nos han capacitado, nos han preparado. La protección es preparación. Considerando que el problema, la destrucción de la madre tierra y la naturaleza está siendo provocada por el ser humano, la solución está en nuestras manos. Porque aunque nos caemos, siempre nos levantamos, somos resilientes.
So pretty powerful. I think we can see the extraordinary resiliency. And when we were talking, Tasneem, before this, you talked about the importance of investing in grassroots actors, and I think we see that as being one of the essential dimensions of the challenges ahead. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and one could recognize that even with a small investment, especially in grassroots-based actions, and especially with women, the returns are immense and the impact is just so immense. And thanks for that and for sharing that video, Michelle. So CAN, as one of the largest global networks of environmental civil society, we are focusing on transformational change and working for transformational change that essentially addresses the climate, the gender, the racial and social injustices that we face. And in fact, with COVID-19, with the pandemic, those fault lines in our economies and in our societies has just been made so visible. What you see cannot be unseen. And so with that, the working and addressing the intersectionality between all of these is a critical part of our work now, and especially the kind of COVID recovery plans that governments are putting in place. We're working to ensure that those recovery plans actually talk to these issues and addresses these crises, and particularly, the building of resilience that can deal with these multiple crises that we've had, not just one crisis, but of course you've spoken very eloquently about how they are all interconnected. So that's a big focus of CAN. And then just secondly, I think we cannot strive to bring transformational change in the world if our own organizations are not also stepping up to the plate and transforming ourselves. So there's also a very big internal process of transformation in our network right now, especially to address racial and gender discrimination in any forms, and actually look at shifting power and resources to where, in fact, to address the discrepancy in that kind of power imbalances that we experience. So that's pretty much what we doing in addition to everything else as a network, briefly. But I'd like to hear from you, Michelle, what you would think, the kind of contribution that a group like this could make to, building resilience and building resilience through women's leadership. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think you said it so powerfully, is that we are seeing the intersection of racial, gender, economic, social justice and injustice, and that we must act upon it. And we have a moral imperative, and especially those countries, those companies, those individuals whose prosperity was built on carbon intensive industries. And as you also said, I think we can see a disproportionate impact in terms of the investment that we make in women and girls. Again, foundational investment around gender equality, the capacity to, again, ensure that women and girls have the tools that they need to help families and communities adapt, but also as change agents in the broader conversation on the front lines. And we know that it will cost resources and investment, and we also know that failing to do so will be even more costly. And so as we look at the Global Commission on Adaptation and $1 trillion opportunity that we must pursue, and we must do it at the same time that we're limiting global warming. So I think, again, investing in women and girls is one of the most essential bets that we can make. And we know, it's very simple. We can't address the biggest challenge of our time without the full equality and capacity of half of our population. And, I just look at the backdrop of our California fires. You sort of can imagine, we can all see viscerally the devastation that is happening, and then think about that kind of devastation in the poorest communities around the world, and what that will mean in terms of people paying not only with property damage, but also with their lives. And so we have a moral obligation, and we have a practical imperative to equip the frontline activists, the women like Maria, the women that you work with, the civil society leaders that you work with, Tasneem, and to really ensure that we are taking an intersectional approach, and that we're investing at a foundational level for gender equality, and to ensure that we are lifting up women as change makers, as leaders, and problem solvers at the same time that we're dealing with the disproportionate impact that climate is having on women and girls. So it is an urgent question, and I guess our call to action for this group is to take the inspiration and the calls to action that you will hear over the next couple of days, and to turn that into meaningful catalytic investment and action.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Michelle, for that call to action. And thank you very much for just sharing your thoughts and CARE's work and about women building resilience through women's leadership. In closing, and thanks again, Michelle, it was great sharing a platform with you.
You
Looking
too.
forward to doing this with you again.
Yeah.
And in closing, just to tell everybody that the next session, ensuring human rights for climate refugees, will continue this important conversation that we've just had, and will begin just after a short break at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Thanks again. Thanks, Michelle, and thanks everybody.
Tasneem, for all of your great leadership.
Thank you. Take care.